Hello and welcome to Missions and Visions, coming to you live from Beijing. This is a live webinar focusing on hot-button issues concerning China and the world. The program is also part of CGTN's Global Arena program. I'm Wang Guan, host and news anchor here at CGTN. Our topic today, does China have a global image problem? And if so, how to fix it? Polls from Gallup and Pew Research, among other institutions, show that the views of China are turning increasingly negative. In fact, it is getting unprecedentedly unfavorable. Was that about politics, culture, or just out of fear for the rise of a non-Western power? Did the West get China wrong? To answer some of these questions, we're very happy to be joined today by Lawrence J. Brahm, an American writer, political economist, director, and producer. Also by Frank Sheeran, best-selling author, journalist, and documentary filmmaker. Carl Jia is host of Silk and Steel. Last but certainly not least, Teng Jimeng is Senior Research Fellow at Center for China and Globalization. Welcome, guys. Welcome to this special program. Carl, let me turn to you, if I may. Did the West get China wrong? And if so,
yes.
Why?
Yes, definitely. I mean, sorry, did I interrupt you? I thought that was a quick, easy answer, because for a long time, I remember when I came to United States in 1990, I used to read New York Times religiously. Every day I searched for news about my homeland, China. But the China that was presented in the page of New York Times resembled nothing like the homeland I left behind. I used to chalk it up as Western ignorance about China, because I thought, it's just very hard for Westerner to understand China. The East and West twin shall never meet. But as I became more politically aware, and as I studied the Western coverage in other countries like Russia, for example, I realized Western reporting on China is not an exception, but rather the rule. The rule is there has been a lot of intentionally misinformation about China being reported in the West, in the Western mainstream media. Because for the general population in the West, I'm speaking from my experience living in the United States. I live in the US almost 30 years. Most people on the street, they don't understand China. There's a lot of ignorance about China. So the only news they receive from China is from their mainstream media. And a lot of times, what the mainstream media present to their readers back home is a very, very distorted picture. They chose to laser focus on every negative aspect of China and then blow it up 100 times. And for people who have no context of what China is like, that can be very, very, they get a very distorted view. I like to think of China as the elephant, and we're all blind men fueling up the elephant. And if the only view of the elephant you get on a regular basis is that of the elephant's butt, you never really understand the elephant. That's my analogy.
Yeah, I know that recently you're hosting a Twitter-based podcast and on China, Russia, Ukraine, and you got criticized for that. Let me ask you about that later. But a quick reminder of our audience, we do have our participants from around the world actually tuning in, from universities and institutions the world over, joining us for this discussion. Later on, we do welcome your engagement, your intervention by asking your very own questions regarding this issue. Does China have a global image issue? And if so, how to fix it? Frank, let me turn to you. Where do you think China's global image problem, if there is one, lies?
It's a complicated process because China is rising and the West kind of feeling the pressure of this new competitor. On one side, the Chinese don't have a really long tradition in explaining themselves. They've been the Middle Kingdom. They didn't really care about the neighbors. Now you have to explain yourself. And on the other side, the Western countries, they could set the rules for the world. They could set the global rules. So they have no tradition of listening to other perspectives to other countries. And now, with this new wave of globalization, we need more to understand each other. And now we see the shortcomings. We see how difficult it is to change the perspectives and to understand each other's position.
Indeed, we need mutual empathy to close the gap of information, among other things. And obviously, COVID is not making things easier. If you think about the number and the frequency of people-to-people exchange, which is at its very sad state of affairs. Lawrence, same question to you. Does China have a global image problem?
Well, China, yes. Basically, you have a Western media that has more or less a consensual view on China. And with particularly the United States during the time of Vice President Cheney, who removed legal restrictions, or we could say standards for journalists, where they had to report both sides of a story. So the outcome is that in journalism in America today, you have really the journalism of parties. You have like CNN and the New York Times are with the Democratic Party, Fox, Wall Street Journal, Republican. In a way, they're voicing a prefixed editorial view as opposed to looking at the news. At the same time, from what we've just heard, it's traditionally a characteristic of Chinese people not to brag, to be very humble and low key when expressing their views or wanting to express a particular opinion. It's done with innuendo. This is part of the culture. It's in Asia, we would hear certain comments or statements that are very low key and understand the inner meaning of what is being expressed. The same with looking at the Chinese media. However, in Western media, the way Western society works, particularly in the United States of America, people like to, promote themselves, and they promote themselves very aggressively. And likewise, they'll promote their views and ideas aggressively. And therefore, the communication gap is quite wide, particularly when it comes to media.
Professor Teng, as a Chinese scholar who traveled the world, who studied the relations between China and the rest of the world, are you upset by how China is viewed by the rest of the world and mostly the West?
Well, absolutely. I think I'm pretty much disturbed by what I've been seeing and witnessing and experiencing when I was traveling around the world. And this is why I've been devoting myself to teach and to try to help students to be able to communicate our ideas and understand their ideas. And so in a sense, I'm pretty much kind of caught up in between these two cultures, let's say the East and the West. And what made me so happy right now is that with the increasing effort made by the Chinese government to open up China, to, in a sense, to integrate China into the international community, China has been relatively successful, I think, in conveying and communicating our ideas, and I think most importantly, to accept and to receive new ideas from the outside world. For example, I've seen so many cases in point in academic exchange. More scholars are traveling around the world, especially in Europe, in North America, in South America, and even right now in Africa. And so I'm optimistic in seeing this very trend, this very globalization going on in terms of helping China and bring closer the rest of the world to China. And as I'm speaking, I can recall very, very vivid example of President Xi meeting President Obama in Ann Arbor several years ago.
Yeah, in 2013, I was there in California.
That's right.
Yep.
And President Xi said that the Pacific is large enough to hold China and the U.S. And that's an echo. As I recall my teaching experience, I was teaching Walt Whitman, and Walt Whitman said, "I am large, I contain multitudes." These lines had been sung by Bob Dylan. I've been also teaching Bob Dylan to my Chinese students, and they know that it is basically the idea that we should be large. We should contain multitudes in order to make this world a better world. As Carl said, I mean, the world doesn't need these ignorant people or biased people. We need people with a broader vision of life. And Dylan and Chinese politicians like and literature artists. I mean, these artists are promoting these ideas.
Yeah. I mean, in a perfect world, that would have been the case, right? But in reality, Carl, let me turn to you again. Recently, you're hosting a podcast on Twitter that is getting some traction there on the Chinese perspectives on the Ukraine-Russia crisis. But you were attacked ferociously by some Western reporters, with one reporter calling you a troll holding water for the Chinese government.
Yes, indeed. Actually, I was surprised how many people joined in, and I was particularly surprised how many people from the global south. We had many speakers from all over the world, from Africa, from Latin America, speaking up about their perspective on the current Ukraine-Russia crisis. And it's a very different perspective from the one we normally hear through the Western media, through a Western liberal lens. And I think that's what makes some Western journalists felt threatened, because now they realize the world is not just the Anglophone world. It's not just the people, the readers who dutifully read New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. There are many people all over the world hold drastically different opinions from the one they're trying to propagate to their Western audience. So I think that's why they felt defensive, and the way they express themselves is to call what I'm doing disinformation campaign. But in fact, we're just having ordinary people from all over the world voicing their own to give their own voice air, and that's if they felt threatened by that, I think their own world is pretty fragile.
I mean, Carl, do you feel frustrated? I mean, I lived in the U.S. for 8 years. You would think that with the technology, the military power, and the economic might of the United States, its citizens will be very liberal and open-minded about different views and perspectives and the outside world, right? But the reality is there is a deficit, let's say, of curiosity for the rest of the world, and it's very, very difficult to put in their mind, to communicate with them alternative viewpoints, the views that are different from a liberal, Western mindset, right?
The average Americans are actually very parochial, as you mentioned. It's really odd phenomena with U.S.'s global spanning empire getting its business in every nook and crannies. But most of average citizens of the United States, they don't really care too much for the world affairs. I mean, in a way, I think they're right. Why should they care? Why should they be forced to learn about Ukraine or Taiwan? The only reason they're being told by their media to care is because U.S. empire is actively intervening in these places, so far from the shore of the United States, and it is very frustrating. Yes.
Frank, let me turn to you. The West is a big and vague concept that we all know. The West is not a monolithic whole. We have Europeans, we have Americans, some even categorize Latin America as part of the West. As a European, how do you look at the perception of China among the European citizens, especially the ordinary folks? Do you think language is a key problem? Because you talk about the fact that China is having a hard time getting its voice out. But let's face it, English has been the lingua franca of the world for the past 100 years.
I think it's not so much language, but it's a lack of skills to understand each other. But we have to say it's quite a normal process in history, the way China is treated right now. I don't say that it's a good process, but if you look at how Germany was treated in the Industrial Revolution when they were growing against the British people, and the British people invented the slogan "Made in Germany" to bad-mouthing the German industry products. The British Empire was looking down on America until America was so strong that they couldn't look down on them anymore. So this is a quite normal process in history, but we shouldn't accept it. We should try to make it better this time. We should try to be able in a better way to see the world in each other perspectives. And there's a lot to learn from both sides to understand why China looks on the world from a different perspective, because they have a different history, they have different culture, there's so many people, they have a different path to go. And on the other side, the Chinese should understand why the Western people are probably now full of fear, because they think China is so big and Asia is so big, and they still like their life and their values, and they're fearing that they probably have to change their values and their lifestyles because of the rise in China. At the end, it's actually a good process, because a real multipolarian world order is emerging. Because in the last century, the Western countries, they could set the rule, the minority, the Western countries could set the rule for the world, for all the other people. And now many of those people are saying, yes, thanks a lot. We have different ideas. We have different views of how the world should look. And so we should both work together to fill up this multipolarian world order with different views and try to understand each other.
Yeah, Lawrence, Frank brought up a very interesting concept, that is we're becoming a multipolar world. Let's look beyond the West for a second. China's perception is not that negative. If you ask a Russian, an Arab, a Latin American, or people, or someone in the Southeast Asia, right? There are diverging views about how China is perceived among the Western population and those in the Arab world, for example. How do you look at the fact that China is viewed very differently? Do you think China has some, very positive perceptions from, for example, like I said, the Arab world?
Well, first of all, if you're looking at Africa, for an example, since you mentioned this, China simply wrote off all of its debt that Africa owed in one go. This is very, very different than anything that the IMF or World Bank would have ever done, or any of the Western lenders. And in case of China's own experience and development, a lot of it was built around building infrastructure, basic infrastructure, roads, communication, clean water systems. All of these things were priorities before trying to evolve into any kind of political framework that Western countries might wish to see. And other countries around the world, for their own cultural reasons, have their own reasons for evolving their own political systems that will not be the same as Western countries as well. But it's the core focus on infrastructure that allows an economy to move forward, allows people to become educated. If you don't have lights in your home, how are your kids going to be able to read, or even get on the computer, or even be able to connect to internet? These things are all about infrastructure. And I think China's own development experience has been very realistic for a lot of the developing world. And that's why they are able to, communicate. But there's also cultural reasons for this mutual understanding. If you wanted to really look at the quintessential difference between Chinese thinking and Western thinking, it really comes down, or all Asian thinking for that matter, it really comes down to one point, and that's duality versus non-duality. And in a Western context, particularly in an American context, we're always being taught to think about right, wrong, good, bad, black, white. And the winner always has to win and the loser always has to lose. It's ingrained into our thinking from movies, television shows, from the time we grow up, to our very sports, football, basketball. Everything is about this polemic, winner, loser, right, wrong. And of course, it extends into the politics as well, where you have political parties who can't agree on anything. And that's totally different in an Asian context, where you really have an entire thinking is built around the yin and yang, or in South Asia, the Shakti, Shiva, Yabyum in Bhutanese or Tibetan. It's actually the same. It's really looking at different aspects of a whole and harmonizing them, finding a way that both of these aspects are understanding, first of all, that they're integrated, that they're together, that there is no right, wrong, there is no good, bad, there's no black and white. There is always a different aspect of perspectives for reasons that have a reason, that have an origin, and to understand those and to try and find balance. And I think in this is where we see the fundamental difference, a difference in not being able to understand China because there has to be judgment. There has to be a singular viewpoint which doesn't accept and embrace other viewpoints. And really this comes down to the philosophies of these two parts of the world. And to some extent, the religiosity is the source of the origin, an aspect of, being the chosen or being the mandate or the manifest destiny. These are all things which are exclusivities of the right that my view is correct and others are not. And that's very different from an Asian perspective. I don't care what country you are in Asia, Southeast Asia. It's really always about finding a consensus and a way forward that brings everyone together, even if there are differences, and trying to find commonalities above those differences so that everybody can keep moving forward. And I think that's also shared in many parts of the developing world, Africa, Middle East, because of the traditional trade routes that have existed for thousands of years, really. A lot of these ideas are shared.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Henry Kissinger's book on China, where he contrasted the Western mindset with the Chinese mindset and likened the difference to the differences between the Chinese Go and international chess, where he argues that the Go is all about relative advantage, strategic encirclement, and the international chess is about winner takes all and absolute annihilation. Professor Teng, let me turn to you. I mean, Kishore Mahbubani, for example, argues that China is, quote unquote, clumsy when explaining and defending itself. Don't you think that is the case sometimes? And how can China really solve that issue?
Yes and no. I think yes, is because China has always been, or Chinese culture in general has also been known as, Kissinger also talked about China being the subtle, the sophisticated mind, the unspoken subtlety. And in this sense, I think, yes, this is kind of clumsy. We don't speak too much. We don't, like Ram said, we don't brag too much. We don't promote ourselves. But in recent years, I think China is increasingly outspoken. We are increasingly kind of loud in speaking our minds because of China's exposure to the international community. As a foreign language teacher, I've been teaching Chinese students to speak loudly, clearly, and logically. And so in this sense, I think China is expressing itself. But then the way we express ourselves might be different. Think about the American way of expressing itself. Think about the American football game, the American soccer game, and the way that they speak and they present themselves are basically kind of like, you have to present yourself, you have to be on the forefront, you have to be aggressive, you have to be the number one, you have to be attacking. And like Ambassador Qin Gang just said recently in Washington, D.C., he said it's not China, it's not the way we China deal with the world. Our way to deal with the world is to seek harmony, to seek this harmony while keeping the difference. And so that philosophy dominates the Chinese mindset. Now, language is a problem. Language, as is spoken, is basically the most important means to communicate ourselves. And which is why I think that in the current world, like it or not, English is the lingua franca. And so we have to learn, we have to study the language, we have to be analytical. The idea to study the language well is to study the minds, the way of thinking, the culture, tradition behind this very language. And so to use the language well, you have to be able to study the culture, the tradition, and also the very logic behind this very language used to express ourselves. And at the same time, we need to be critical. I mean, the Europeans or the Westerns, the West are in a sense very dominant because this very colonialism. I think colonialism has to be rid off, has to be in a sense critiqued. I mean, in a large scale, so that we can understand, so that we can actually, in a sense, launch ourselves into this very world which is now need to be balanced.
Okay, Carl, let me turn to you now. China has had, China's soft power products has had a relatively smaller impact on the Western consumers than the other way around, right? If you think about the popularity of Netflix shows, Hollywood, NBA, et cetera, among the Chinese consumers. Why do you think that is the case? Carl, can you hear me?
I'm sorry, I unmuted my mic. I think some of the speakers, especially Professor Ten, has already mentioned, it's because we have centuries of Western hegemony, right? So United States in particular naturally have much more soft power than China. So China in essence is trying to catch up right now. And it has a deep learning curve, like Lawrence has mentioned. There's a big cultural gap, right, between China and the general West, but United States in particular. But because U.S. has been the world hegemon for so long, it exports its culture all over the world, and it's the English is a lingua franca. It's very for the countries that's being affected globalization. It's very natural to consume cultural products coming from Hollywood, for example, and whereas China's rise is relatively recent in the world history. I mean, China has been predominant before the European colonization, but for the last 150 years, China was on the bottom in its historical throughout its history. I think the last 150 years can be characterized as the bottom pit for China, and China is just climbing out of that right now. And China also has a lot to learn because of the vast cultural difference, like Lawrence mentioned. When you are trying, it's very important that you need to understand your audience. Because there's such a different mindset. For example, in United States, in Western Europe, you have to understand what your audience is used to, and you have to speak your audience language, right? If they're used to this, black and white, this Manichaean worldview, you have to be able to speak to that. And I noticed that, for example, Chinese media in particular, they tend to avoid controversy, right? That might be cultural thing, but the Western media thrives on controversy. You have to attack. You have to be offensive.
It is a very confrontational society where people love to debate. We're running out of time, Carl. But before we go to our audience for questions, I want to ask a final question to Frank. But before I do, I want to show you this video, a vox pop on the street of America, asking average American citizens how they look at China. If we can play that video for us.
I think more positive things, because you see the Chinese New Year, which is pretty cool. You see how they have the dragon set up, and then with the martial arts. Okay. I see a lot more positive than negative.
Our government is democratic and we all vote and stuff, but in China, I'm under the impression that it's not like that. So I feel like we don't have a lot to go on. So in portraying them, we just put what we think is out there.
I would say that the perception of it just being communist skews perspective, because I would think a lot of Americans just see that they're communist and then they draw similarities to Russia, And so they just see that as strictly being negative because of just how bad Russia was when they were Soviets.
I think for the future, there's a big kind of consensus that China's going to become this new tech giant that's kind of ruling over a lot of, the tech power in the same way that maybe America does now. It's going to kind of be like China's turn.
Well, Frank, given the ownership of media outlets, given the bias inherent or not of media organizations, how constructive can media's role still be in bridging the gap of understanding between different cultures?
Media can be very attractive and very constructive if they do it in the right way, if they're able to explain the different perspectives. And if they're able to see the historical dimensions. We were just talking about soft power. If you just look back at the beginning of the 20th century, people, the British Empire, they couldn't imagine the soft power America would have one day. It was unthinkable. But it developed as well. And I think if you look from this perspective to the Chinese development, and it's probably quite likely that they're going to develop their way of soft power. Or if you look, we were just talking about the way Africa and China get along, and there are all these quite important and impressive reasons Lawrence mentioned, but at the end of the day, there's even a more simple reason why they get along better, because they are both rising countries, and established countries understand other established countries easier, and rising countries understand other rising countries easier. And if there's a journalism who is explaining these kind of developments and the different perspectives, then it can be a very constructive and fruitful way of journalism.
Alrighty, now let's open it up for questions from our audience members from around the world. Please raise your hand if you have a question, dear friends. Good to see all of you there. Hello. Who has a question? Okay, the first question goes to Zhou Ruinan, please.
Hi. Thank you so much.
Sure, go
My
ahead.
name is Zhou Ruinan. I'm a college student majoring in journalism. And my question is for everyone in the discussion. So,
sorry, Ruinan, you have to pick one. You have to pick one. We're running out of time. Pick one guest who can answer your question.
Okay, I'd like to. My question is for Carl. So, how would you describe China's image now? Let me elaborate on that quickly. Western reporting on China seems to be monotonous, like a state with little place for public discussion. However, on Weibo, China's Twitter, for instance, people are expressing strong views on either end of the spectrum about national and international affairs. So will this make the China story more difficult to tell, or it's a chance to tell a more layered and nuanced story?
All right, Carl.
I'll mute myself. There's always a lot of chance to tell the layer and nuanced story of China, but currently the Western mainstream media has decided to wage propaganda instead. The airwave is clogged up with anti-China narratives. So if they can just get back to simply tell the story, and like many of the guests have expressed a wish for actually building a cultural bridge of understanding, that will be ideal. But we're not there right now, unfortunately, because the rising tensions between US and China, and there have been a lot of intentional misinformation about China in Western media. And luckily, there are some popular Chinese platform, for example, TikTok, that's gaining more popularity. And people can see The advantage of TikTok is people can see average people in China living their life, and they realize the Chinese, just like the rest of us, are human beings. I think that really does a lot to humanize China. It's my short answer.
All right, great. Who else has a question? Omar, I see you over there. Omar, floor is yours. Omar, go ahead. Unmute yourself, please. Unmute yourself, please.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, Omar, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Omar. I'm an Iraqi, been in China for 26 years. So as I'm an Iraqi, which is a country being invaded by the many West countries, as been in China for 26 years, I will send a question to the three principals here. I want to ask about, as I'm an Iraqi and I've been in China for 26 years, as these days I'm seeing that in the West media, they've been a lot of lies in the Twitter, I can see in the many newspapers. But my question is not going to be attacking all the West, because as we see our hands, they are different long, so everybody will be different. There is the good media and there's the bad media. My question is, what is the reason these kind of Twitter medias or some Western medias, they're blocking China, they're blocking the name, they're blocking the image of China, and they're in the same time, they're blocking the name of many Arab countries. As I say again, I'm a person who come from Iraq. I've been in China for 26 years. So I'm speaking from different starting points as an Arab and being in China. And it means that my different 2 points, they've been attacked by some of the, I'm saying, can I say it by the black Western media? Why they are attacking, what's the reason, what they want to get from blocking innocent people or blocking innocent countries? This is, I'm till today, I've been asking this question to many of the people, but I didn't get a real answer that can convince me why the media, Western media is blocking many Arab countries and blocking now China also.
Who wants to answer this question?
I can take
Professor
a shot.
Teng, give it a shot, would you?
Sure. I mean, first of all, you have a very clear agenda that's coming out of Washington. You have to understand American policy making comes from two cities. It comes from Washington, D.C. and New York. And it's basically also connected with financial markets, given the fact that the entire government depends on debt, and that debt ultimately buys back its own debt. That debt in turn goes into the capital markets, and it goes where? It usually goes into the social media, the sort of what they call FANG, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. I mean, it goes into basically these stocks and a few more like Twitter. The advantage of these companies is that they're actually, because they're tech, they are gathering information on you, these internet companies, constantly. So there's about something like Facebook has about 5,000 points on every person who uses it. So they know what you eat, they know what you like, they know what you don't like, and they can align themselves very quickly with the hand that feeds them, with, again, the debt markets, which are then coming from buyback from the Fed, and of course that's respecting or responding to policy agendas. And if we're talking about in a post-colonial world that you really have a kind of still, it's not post-colonial, you still have a kind of new colonialism. It's involved in financial markets, it's involved in trade, it's involved in other aspects of control. They don't want, first of all, rising powers to have a voice. They don't want the third world to have a voice. They don't want to have the countries that they once decolonized to have an independent voice. And they're not looking to allow the creativity to emerge from those nations. So they're continuing to push an agenda, a demonizing agenda. And the social media networks allow for that to be managed very well, very efficiently, through either blocking information or, in the case, observing what people's fears are and playing on those fears aggressively with information or misinformation. Again, anything can be edited. I also, what Carl was talking about earlier, I just get back on a point that I know so often here, I know so many journalists over the years, and I would see people reporting things, and then at the end of the day, their newspapers and their networks are not reporting what they have observed. And that's because editorials come in and said, change the story. That's not the story we want to tell. And many journalists in confidence will also reflect that this is their own frustrations, that even if they want to report a story in a particular way, they can't, because the agenda at the home editorial side will be different, because it's reflecting political agendas, it's reflecting financial agendas, it's reflecting agendas from advertisers, and those in turn are also very much politically driven by lobbying groups, etc. So there's a whole matrix of forces there that are leading to this outcome.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Noam Chomsky's book on manufacturing consent. Thanks for that, Lawrence. Now the next question goes to Zhao Xuanling, please. Xuanling, unmute yourself first. Xuanling, unmute yourself first.
Okay. Hi.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I'm a grad student at Beijing Foreign Studies University. My question goes to Frank. As you have mentioned, the Western media sees China as a threat. But strangely, there are also Western powers in this world, but we Chinese don't see them as threats. What caused these two different mindsets? Thank you.
I'm not really sure if there are on the China side, sometimes people see the Western countries as a threat as well. And if we criticize Western media, we should always also say that not everything which is published in Chinese media is true as well. So there are both sides of the story, and probably for different reasons and for different in different ways, there are wrong perspectives and wrong stories emerging. And what we really should do, we should get rid of these wrong perspectives for whatever reason they emerge. It doesn't really matter. We should try to find the truth, and we should stay curious. We should try to learn from each other. I think that's the most important thing, because a different culture, a different civilization has different advantages and disadvantages. And in my time here in China, I learned so much in dealing with China about my culture, about what we do different and probably what we do not better than the Chinese. So, and I think this, if we move in this direction, that should be a very good path to understand each other and to really learn from each other, and instead of staying on our own values and trying to force the others to accept our values and our way to see the world.
Yeah, so oftentimes we became prisoners of our own narratives, like it or not. The next question goes to Cao Ruiling.
And hello, I'm a graduate student from Communication University of China. And here I have a question for Lawrence. And have you ever worked on any topics related to China? And do you think there are any points to note or have any suggestions when presenting the image of China to overseas audiences? And thank you very much.
Sure. Most of my filmmaking actually is connected to China, or it's connected to the Asian, to Himalayan region. We do a lot of things at high altitudes, documentary films, movies. Now we're doing a movie series. But recently we did a film called Searching for Kung Fu. And this addresses this issue square on, because to be able to try and convey Chinese values to the outside world, values of harmony with nature, values of respect, values of perseverance, values of pragmatism, values of flow, values of a middle way. How do you present these values? I think this has been a struggle for many of China's documentarians. And we felt that really using Kung Fu as a language is something that would be able to cut through a lot of misunderstandings very quickly and speak to a global audience very fast. And because, we use an example, we hear about the Confucian institutes that were established overseas to promote, Chinese culture, but foreigners don't know what Confucianism is all about, or Confucius, or any of these things. But everybody knows Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, Jet Li. A lot of the rap groups in America today, they use Kung Fu imagery because in their mind, Kung Fu stands up for righteousness, for justice. We have the Wu-Tang Clan is the most famous. Wu-Tang is a style of martial arts from the Wu-Tang Mountain. These are areas where we can grasp the human interest and we can communicate very quickly in a fun way that gets these ideas across. Ideas of, and the way we did it was to actually use different martial arts to present an idea. So for instance, in Wing Chun, there's emphasis on the middle strike, always in the middle. And we then talked about the middle way, about how we're always seeking consensus and trying to not be drawn apart with different poles, but to try and find a common way forward in everything as a part of the culture. Or for instance, using Tai Chi as an example, to talk about harmony with nature, about balance between yin and yang. Ba Gua is a style that involves constant movement. We talked about that for change. Chinese are always facing change and adapting to it very quickly. And the world has to adapt to a changing, growing environment that involves new countries and powers and cultures. And so, again, finding a common language to present an idea that communicates it quickly to people that they can relate to is probably the best way, I think, for us to find commonality. Even in our film, we propose something called Kung Fu diplomacy. If we want to think about the Cold War ended, or the process of the Cold War was beginning to end in 1971 when a ping pong team came to China from the US, and then we had Nixon's visit in 72 and the beginning of normalization of relations. Well, nobody plays ping pong anymore. They're busy with cell phones. So why not Kung Fu diplomacy with sports and cultural exchanges?
Very good tips, Lawrence. The next question goes to Baitesi Petros.
Thank you, Wang Guan, and all the speakers. My name is Petros, and I joined you from the Sinai island of Cyprus after spending a few years in Beijing. Interestingly, I run a community that helps young foreigners find jobs in China. And I have a question for Professor Tang. In what ways do young people in East and West influence each other's views? And how can we build more bridges for these young leaders of tomorrow and strengthen our mutual understanding, other than learning English or encouraging them to learn English and Chinese?
Good, thank you. Thank you very much for the great question. I think one way to bridge the gap or increase this very mutual understanding is to bring ourselves closer, spiritually and geographically and even intellectually. And most importantly, I think intellectually. To bring ourselves closer intellectually, first thing I think is learn and learn mutually our mutual cultural traditions, our histories, and perhaps our geographies, our politics, our political institutions. And so in a sense, it's all about bringing ourselves to that very point where we can actually share one common language, one common thing. But then the world is different. And the point that we come to this very converging point is not to, in a sense, to converge ourselves. It's not to conform ourselves. I think the most beneficial point is, at that very converging point, is to understand not just the very different, similarities, but also the differences. Like Lawrence was elaborating on martial arts. Now, martial arts could be a point of departure to understanding China and perhaps to understand this very world. As Kishore Mahbubani said, our world in the future could be a world in which there is conflict, increased conflict, culturally, spiritually, religiously, perhaps politically, most importantly. And so we need to, in a sense, understand this very difference to overcome that, so that we can overcome that very difference. Now, back to this very bridge thing. Take martial arts, for example. Now, martial arts, yes, it is an art form that tells us about this very harmony, this very harmonious movements in order to achieve the better kind of harmonious effect. But then don't forget, martial arts is also the product of war. It's the product of war. It is a skill developed by monks, by common people to defend themselves. Now, if we continue to develop and to tell the world that the martial arts is all for harmony, and then the rest of the world who believe in, especially the West, who believe in this jungle law kind of a thing, martial arts could be seen as a sign of weakness. Now, my suggestion is, why don't we also present the other side of martial arts? If you see, for example, Shaolin Temple, starring Jet Li, it's not about martial arts being in harmony with nature, but it's about defending ourselves. It's about kind of justice prevailing evil. And if you see Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, it's also about martial arts involved in this very emotional conflict. The emotional conflict between the male lead, starring Li Mubai, and also this Xu Lian. And so it's about this emotional conflict, eventually resolved, evolving around this very martial arts, and then eventually resolved through martial arts.
Yep.
It's for example, like there is also a character who wants to kill, and then eventually Xu Lian said, I want to kill you without killing you. I mean, the sword, the green destiny sword, eventually became a source of a peace that people use to resolve this very social conflict. Yep. And that's why, I'm sorry.
No, thanks so much, Professor Teng. Thanks for this nuanced perspectives. Understand that Frank Siren will have to leave us. Thank you so much for coming on our show. Frank, come back again, please. And in the meanwhile, let's go to the next question. Zhang Chen. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Zhang Chen. Now I'm a freshman in Communication University of China. My question goes to Mr. Wang Guan. As we know, a few days ago, yes.
Okay, go ahead.
A few days ago, German media said that Russia had bombed Kyiv, but in that report, what they've used is a video of Tianjin Pass explosion. So I want to ask your opinion towards this terrible misleading report. Thank you.
Can you repeat the question? I mean, the conflict in Kiev and the explosion in Tianjin, or what is it?
Yes. I want to ask your opinion about this misleading report. I mean, they used Tianjin report explosion to report the bomb in Kyiv. Thank you.
I mean, thank you for the question. I mean, thank you for putting me on the spotlight. I mean, of course, there are double standards, right? If you read my book, Manufacturing the China Consent, there are different standards when it comes to the coverage of terrorism, for example. The Western media's coverage of terrorism attacks in Paris, in Madrid, in London versus those in Tunis, Nigeria, and Palestine, for example, are uneven. And also there are different resources dedicated to each Western life lost, a whole lot of them, versus each non-Western life lost to terrorism. But I think questions should really be directed to our experts, real experts over there, than over to me. However, I will be more than happy to talk to you about this question later on in person if I go back to our Alptometer. 中国传媒大学. Okay, the next question goes to Zhou Yun.
Hello. Thank you very much for giving me a chance. I'm Zhou Yun, also from Communication University of China. I have one question for Professor Teng. We know that never before has public discourse been so important, spawning a war of narratives and new counter-discursive strategies in international politics. A recent example was Joe Biden's Summit for Democracy in December last year, which promoted China to hold its own online version of the event. I want to know how can China could be more proactive and take the lead rather than just playing tit for tat. Thank you.
That's a complicated question. I would point you to Ambassador Qin Gang, who is now stationed in Washington, D.C. This is a gentleman who has been in diplomacy, who has been serving Chinese in the Chinese diplomatic society community for a long time. His English is very good. He knows better. I mean, he knows the world much better as he has been traveling extensively with Chinese leaders and Chinese statesmen around the world. And so, first thing I would say, let China continue to expose itself to the rest of the world. Let us continue to be exposed and to engage ourselves to the rest of the world. Ambassador Qin Gang's latest remarks made in the U.S. is a shining example to communicate with the world and to stand out most prominently, not in that very confrontational manner, but a little bit of kind of tit for tat. That's my interpretation. Now, when you're engaged in that very kind of a game, you have to know your partner, you have to know your rival, and you have to be able to speak the language of your rival or your competitor. And so in this case, I think the example Ambassador Qin Gang evoked, the American football, is a typical case in point. If you need to prevail, if you want to prevail, understand your rival, understand the very secret behind your rival or your competitor, and then come up with a solution, come up with your own solution. Instead of doing this thing in a defensive way, but then try to come up this very option or alternative or solution in advance. I think the trouble with China right now is that we don't have an option. We don't have an option in advance. The idea, I think, to cope with this very world is to come up with your idea and to come up with the solution and try that on perhaps on an error and trial basis. Take, for example, perhaps the current conflict in Ukraine. There are multiple nations involved, multiple organizations involved in negotiating this very truce or peace in that very country. China has also been very active. In fact, I would say proactive. Foreign Minister Wang Yi has been very proactive in speaking, in talking, and in negotiating. Now, this is the way I think China as a world power needs to do. I mean, to engage proactively, to provide a solution in advance, and to see far beyond this very current crisis or conflict, and provide solutions. Because we know right now, as Kishore Mahbubani has said, that the world ahead of us is going to be a world of conflict. And that world of conflict, in a sense, needs solution. And that's why I think that be proactive is a way to overcome the very current dilemma that the world is now facing or now being trapped in. Thank you.
All right. The next question comes from Chen Luixia.
Hi there, this is Chen Luixia from Beijing Foreign Studies University. Thank you very much for the great discussion and the opportunity for me to ask the question. This question goes to Frank and Professor Teng. My question is, from your point of view, what can we do to diminish the image problem towards China and to solve the global image problem? For example, from the perspective of an average person, a student like me, a company, our media, and our government sector. Thank you.
Okay, you know what? I think Carl should answer this question too, because Carl is really in the front line, battling those, I would say, a lot of the misinformation out there on the Twitter sphere, among others. Carl, why don't you give it a shot first?
So if I understand correctly, you're asking what can you do personally to combat some of the misinformation about China? Is that the question?
Yeah. From the perspective, like, what can we do from the perspective of me, a company like Tencent or Alibaba, our media and the government, like different stakeholders?
Okay, Tencent and Alibaba could do a lot more because they have a lot more resources. I think, I go back to the example of TikTok, and I go back to example of very successful Chinese game like Genshin Impact, right? That has a global audience, and Genshin Impact also used the game to showcase a lot of Chinese culture, and that really. So these are the example of successful Chinese Chinese soft power and Chinese cultural export. For big companies, they could do that, and for individuals, I think you just have to speak up. You just have to speak up, and especially, I think it works best in people-to-people communication. To convince the people, in your own friend circle, for example, if you have Western friends, if you have foreign friends, just by show them how you live your life in China, that sometimes could have a better, I think, more, it might be more effective than say, whatever our state or whatever Chinese state media is doing. Because
Carl, I really want to follow up on that regarding the art of persuasion, right? You're a bilingual speaker of English and Chinese, and not everyone has that privilege or skill set. When you engage intellectually or in a debate with your fellow Western friend, how can you really convince one? Because chances are, oftentimes you find them to be very, very assertive, if not aggressive. They grew up in an environment that is, they're encouraged by their parents, by society, to be their own people.
I never try to convince people. It's, because when people are conditioned to think of a certain way from their childhood, you are trying to convince them is trying to change someone's religion, right? What I do when I engage public debate, for example, with somebody who holding totally opposite point of view, what I'm trying to do is not trying to change the view of the person I'm debating. I'm trying to change the view of people tuning in to listen, because there will be somebody who realize like I'm making, maybe by making a better points with facts, and that they come to view my point of view more favorably. So that's what I try to do. I never try to actively try to convince, trying to convert somebody else, but I try to present with more facts, with more information. And there will be people with more open mind, with curiosity to seek out more information. They may come to me and they may find some information that will help them understand China better.
All right, fair enough. One more question, Richard.
Hi, I'm a student from University Colorado of Denver. So I have one question to Mr. Lawrence. So I study the major of the communication of political and critical. So you know that when Western media report China and Chinese issues, they use the structure and the discourse like the democracy versus authority. So from your perspective of the journalism, so do you think we have the possibility to reset a new system discourse to report China? Thank you.
Well, first of all, yes, you need to be choosing the language that you're going to use to articulate. And in the West, I mean, again, if it's not a mainstream Western media, they will always label other media as propaganda, or they'll say official state media. And if you look at it, we'll just go back again to your debt systems. If you have federal debt that is basically supporting internet companies, you could also call that official media. So, it's a question of how you're using the language, how you are putting labels on things. And I think what's really important is to try to have our own labels and to change the language that's being used. And if you use it enough, it gets picked up by the algorithms and it becomes standardized. And you can see almost all the Western press has standard ways of picking and choosing the language they use where they want to put a cap on something, whether it's China or whether it's countries of the Middle East, or basically anyone that they don't understand or they want to put into a framework or put down. They very quickly will develop a vocabulary for it.
Alrighty, we'll have one final question from Yang Rongkun. Please go ahead.
Hello, it's my honor to have this chance, and I have a question for Carl. There's a new term that is Generation Z. They are those who are born after 1995 and 2000. And in the context of a globalized world, I think they are more open-minded and more inclusive. And the future, I believe, is in the hands of them. So do you have any suggestions for Generation Zers to better tell Chinese stories that are more real and easy to understand for foreigners? Thank you.
Okay. All right. I agree. I think the Zoomer or the Generation Z, they're literally the future. And a lot of what I noticed, especially in China, the youngins, they're better educated, they have better language skills. Many of them are fluent English speakers, if not other languages as well. And they can do very well in people-to-people communication. For example, they by showcasing their own culture, share among their friends. If they have foreign friends, many of them do, because many of them do travel outside of China, and by showcasing the real life in China, I think it's quite eye-opening for people who are not who in their everyday life do not know what China is like. When their most source of information is coming from Western mainstream media, to actually hear it from a real Chinese person and to see how Chinese people actually live their lives. I think that the Generation Z can do a lot to help humanize Chinese people, because at the end of the day, as long as people outside of China can see Chinese are actually human beings just like them, you're already winning. That's my answer.
All right. Finally, I would like to invite three of our guests to share their final thoughts, maybe in one sentence or two. Professor Teng, why don't I go with you?
Well, young people, especially the Z generation, are tech savvy, they're knowledgeable, they're intellectual, they're open, they're also very inclusive. Now, spot on. Just go on and know the world around you, speak to the world around you, interact yourself with the world around you. Thank you.
Alrighty, Lawrence.
Just tell human stories. I think that's the most important thing. And if you look at the methodology of a lot of media, like the New York Times, will always start off with a human story, an individual who has suffered or who has, achieved something. And so I think it's the human story that touches people faster, rather than just trying to send a message or put forward a point of view. Do it in a subtle way through an individual's life and what they have achieved or overcome. And I think that can be something understood by people everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Carl.
I think Professor Tang and Lawrence said everything.
They set the bar pretty high, right?
I 100% agree. Tell the human story. Be more engaging especially for the youngins who have the language skills. Tell their own story. Tell their own personal story. That will do a lot.
And do as you do. I mean, set up your own podcast. Do it through your own podcast. I think, Carl, you are doing podcasts, right?
Yes.
Good. That's good.
Yeah, you guys should check out Carl's mini podcast. Carl, maybe you should do some of those on Chinese media platforms. Popularity guaranteed. Alrighty, I want to thank all of you and also our audience members for tuning in today. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for spending time with us. Carl, Lawrence, Frank earlier, and Professor Teng, we learned so much from you guys. And thank you for watching Missions and Visions. That will do it for this edition. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Do stay tuned for our future episodes. Thank you for watching.